Hey everyone, thanks so much for being here. My name is Claire Kellaway. I am the food program manager at Open Markets, and I'm very excited to launch our food and farming panel. Got a great lineup today. Hand it off to Stu, who is with the Minnesota Farmers Union, to moderate the panel, talk a little bit about our panelists and what we're going to cover. So.
Mic pass. My name is Stu Lourey. I do government relations for Minnesota Farmers Union. We're a grassroots general farm organization. We were founded in 1902 in Texas and Minnesota in 1918. And we came out of the cooperative movement and farmers coming together and seeing consolidation in the folks who were selling them inputs, the folks that were buying their products on the other side, and they realized that they weren't going to get a fair price for the work that they were doing unless they came together and marketed collectively, bought collectively, and also organized democratically to elect folks to enact market reforms and antitrust policies. And I think I'm excited to work for Farmers Union because we're focused on a lot of those same challenges today. So our members have long recognized that when you have 4 meat packers that control 85% of beef processing in this country, and you got 98% of cattle that are slaughtered at 50 plants, that's not going to be fair for farmers. And we also understood that it's not going to be fair for workers or consumers either. And that's why our organization launched a campaign called Fairness for Farmers. You can look us up online if you're driving around farm country listening to ag radio. Hopefully you'll hear some radio spots from our organization trying to raise awareness about the damaging effect monopolies have had on farmers, workers, and consumers, which brings us to our topic here today. And I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. If I know anything about antitrust work in food and agriculture, I learned it from these 3 folks and a couple others. So it's an honor to be here, and I'll introduce them briefly before we get started. We have Elizabeth Odette, who's an assistant attorney general at Attorney General Keith Ellison's office, focused on food and ag antitrust. We do a bunch of work with her and her fantastic team at Farmers Union. We have Diana Tastad-Damer, who's director of legislative and political affairs at the United Food and Commercial Workers, Local 1189. I've had a fantastic opportunity to work with her on a number of issues, including trying to build an alternative meat processing model in central Minnesota, which has been a lot of fun and a learning experience for our organization. And finally, Hannah Bernhardt, farmer and owner of Medicine Creek Farm, and someone I'm proud to call a member of Farmers Union. So with that, I wonder if we could start, Diana, with you, going a little bit out of order. I think the reason that we're having conversations about competition in ag markets and having a broader conversation with the public is because of what happened during COVID-19. We were indemnifying 10,000 hogs a day in Minnesota for a few months. Workers were getting sick in packing plants and often dying, and I think that raised attention to the issues that our organizations have seen in the consolidated meatpacking industry for a long time. So I'm wondering if you can tell us more about what happened during COVID and what your organization has done to respond to it.
Yeah. So when COVID started, it was the unknown for a lot of people, and we started doing national calls because what was happening in Colorado was what we were seeing here in Minnesota, and wherever there was a meatpacking plant, we were trying to figure out what the employer was trying to do and what our members were facing. And so what we saw is throughout COVID in the United States, when meatpacking plants closed down because workers were getting sick, Europe did not see the same struggle that we did, right? In Minnesota, right, farmers had to kill their hogs and lose a lot of their profit, right? In Europe, where we have smaller and more mid-sized meatpacking plants, they were able to be more resilient, right, with plant closures. Because if a plant closed in one area, they were able to bring the animals to a different. So they did not see the same struggle as what we saw here in the United States. And then I just want to, we also represent grocery store workers. And so when COVID-19 happened in our retail stores, workers were being inundated, right, with toilet paper, right? You couldn't find toilet paper, and if there was toilet paper on the shelves, people wanted to buy all of it, and people would get in fights over it, which posed a risk to our members. And so when we were talking about the Smithfield plant in South Dakota closing down, they produce 5% of all pork production in the United States. What happens when all of these meatpacking plants that are closing down, which is good for our members to help protect them, happen? And what happens when that food is not on the shelves in the grocery stores, right? What happens to our workers in retail? If people are fighting over a lack of toilet paper, what's going to happen when there is lack of food, right? So it was this, how do we make sure that we are providing enough food for people to buy, and so there's not panic that there is a lack of food, but also protecting our meatpacking workers and our retail workers. And it was a difficult thing to navigate. And when you talk about antitrust, you see, Tyson going to the White House and basically writing their own rules, right? And not caring about the workers, not caring about the ranchers, right? They get to just write their own rules, and the government gets to sign off on it, which was unfortunate. But that's kind of like what we saw and what we were trying to navigate, and every day was kind of uncertain. So.
Absolutely, that's powerful, and I wonder, we'll keep bouncing around a little bit, but I want to go to Hannah next, and then we'll go to you, Elizabeth. But Diana talked about the impact of consolidation on workers who work in these large packing plants, JBS and Smithfield in Minnesota. You're a farmer, but you don't sell to those plants, right? And so how does consolidation affect your operation, selling direct to consumer, and the life you're able to create in rural Minnesota?
Well, kind of actually the story that I told to the Fairness for Farmers campaign to National Farmers Union is that I grew up on a corn and soybean farm in southern Minnesota, and I grew up during the farm crisis of the 80s. And so actually during that time, my dad had to take an off-farm job, and of course who was hiring but Farm Credit Services, as they were needing more help to foreclose on other farms. And so while I didn't, hear the direct stories at the time, I grew up in an atmosphere where the feeling was very much known to me and all of my friends that farming is a really difficult way to make a living. So I didn't have a totally positive outlook on agriculture in general. And I didn't really understand all of the factors playing into it, until I went away to college. And I started learning about how kind of the economics worked, and learning that, farmers in commodity markets don't have control over the price of any of their inputs. There's very few suppliers to buy from, and they set the price, and you have to take it. And then on the other end, you don't have control over the price that you're getting for your end product. Again, you have to take whatever you can get. And so really you're farming in a straitjacket. And so I really only, tiptoed my way back into agriculture when, living on the East Coast, I saw that there was kind of a new movement of farmers, young farmers, who were doing things differently. And, that was tied in with the organic movement, but it was also really based on direct marketing and the community-supported agriculture model. And so this is where I started to see a way out of that straitjacket. And so now I raise grass-fed beef and lamb and pastured pork. Because of my practices, I don't have to rely on those inputs. I don't have to pay anyone for fertilizer because of the way that I'm raising my animals. I'm direct marketing, and so I'm selling all my products to the end consumer just through my website. However, I've come to a realization that I still haven't totally escaped that straitjacket because of consolidation still. So I can't do everything. While I've added marketing to my portfolio, I can't also find the time to butcher all of my animals and do the meat cutting as well. So I have to rely on skilled labor for that. And unfortunately, because of consolidation, there are very few USDA processors for me to work with. And because of that reason, I'm really limited to what I can offer my customers. So, I can do things one way, but if I want to add a new product, if I want to add value-added products, which is often a way to make more money, I have no options. I could drive a lot farther, but also it's really hard to get into a new butcher. You have to have a relationship. I'm booking already a year in advance. So I can't grow. I can't grow quickly, like when the pandemic happens and suddenly I have an influx of customers. I can't just suddenly add more animals. The butcher can only take so many, and I don't have anywhere else to go. We're also getting into agritourism, and so we're going to start an on-farm store. But again, my butcher, because they're already so busy, they don't have any incentive to add more of these value-added products, so I can't get brats and hot dogs to sell in my store, and that's what people would be buying out of that location. So yeah, I thought that I was kind of escaping, and yet I'm still finding that while I've kind of gotten out on some issues, there's still consolidation affecting my ability to grow a business.
Absolutely. And if I could ask you to build on that too, and I think this ties into what Diana was talking about with the supply chain challenges, but I think it's easy to, when we think about market reforms or anti-monopoly policy, it's easy to think about people as farmers or workers or consumers, and that ignores the fact that oftentimes people are all of those things, right? 85% of farmers or more have off-farm income that they rely on to support their operation. All the folks who are dealing with those supply chain challenges and angry customers were also struggling to find toilet paper, I'm sure. And so I wonder, Hannah, if you could say a little bit more about you as a consumer. I know you've done work around dollar store, building on the last conversation, and living in rural Minnesota, and what consolidation looks like there.
Yeah, so in our little towns, my town has a population of about 350 people, and we still have managed to keep a gas station that has expanded into selling a little bit more groceries, and a hardware store / ag store, and a small cafe. And really this is because of tourism in a way. People are coming up and going to the cabin, and so they do want that small town feel. And that's something that I'm trying to build on too with agritourism, is like, this is a region with something to offer, and we're unique place and wanting to draw people for those reasons. However, we've been facing the dollar stores trying to move in. So we have one grocery store in the little bit bigger town called Sandstone Chris's Food Center, and they had a second location in Pine City that actually closed when Walmart moved in. And so now, for the kind of little area of 5 towns or so, all shopping at this one grocery store, there's a Dollar General on one side, and then in the past few years, a Family Dollar moved in on the other side. So it's literally sandwiched between 2 dollar stores. And then in my town of only 300 people, they also came in and tried to start one there. And then when the city township was able to keep them out, they actually moved about 2 miles down the road and approached an egg ranch, which, despite the fact that they had about 20 barns full of egg layers, was also going out of business because that's considered too small in the industry to make a profit. And it was only because of, citizens paying attention and being active that the township also turned them down. So, but that's the thing, you have to be paying attention, and you have to just be vigilant and have people really care about your community and what it looks like and keeping those businesses alive, because it's just relentless, you know, they're not going to stop.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that one thing that I'm passionate about is I think the business owner from Moon Palace in the last panel talked about us being in a trance or something with regard to Amazon. And I feel like we sometimes get in a trance thinking that believing that we can vote with our food dollar. And okay, I can be against dollar store and I won't shop there. And we don't think to talk to our township about banning them from our neighborhood, which is more powerful. So before we get to Elizabeth and talk a little bit more about the AG, what the AG is up to, and what tools they have available. Diana, did you want to say anything about the folks you represent as not just workers, but also consumers, building on what Hannah described?
Yeah, no, I think what Hannah described is also where our meat packing processors located, but usually in rural Minnesota, right? And it's the same thing where when you have the Tysons and the Smithfields and the JBSs of the world, I know Tyson sells to Walmart. Well, Walmart, and a multi-million-dollar contract, and when Walmart comes back to Tyson and says, we want X for a price instead of Y, what we've been paying, what happens? Tyson's not going to turn down that contract. They're going to go back to their labor and cut, right? So when we talk about antitrust, it's not just between meat packers, it's also within retailers, right? Like Walmart can squeeze Tyson for a few extra cents per pound or per package, and then that affects our workforce. And then talking about the cattle, when the number one union industry is pork, and then it's beef. The least union is poultry. So when poultry gets increased, the union density is a lot less, so it's harder to keep those union standards of safety and better wages and better health and retirement benefits. So they have less buying power. Workers, right, have less buying power within their own community. So yes, they're working at the plant, but they can't afford to go shop at or buy Hannah's products, right, because they're not earning enough. And if they're lucky, maybe they can drive to Walmart if someone has a vehicle, right, within their family. But that's another thing, is a lot of meatpacking places will bus people in, workers in, 40 miles away, so workers don't even have their own transportation, right? So they're really owning the labor force in a sense, kind of like what Amazon is doing, which also doesn't help the small business owners in small town America. So it's kind of it's a trickle down effect, and it's just cyclical, right? One problem is leading into another, which, doesn't help workers or consumers.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, now going to Elizabeth, and I might start with relying on your expertise and maybe from a former gig that you had working in grocery antitrust. And we talked about that some in the past panel, and we've touched on it here. But what tools does the Attorney General have, and what are the opportunities to help in that space?
Yeah, so I practiced antitrust private plaintiff's firm for about 15 years before joining the Attorney General's office about 2.5 years ago. And in my former life, I did a decade-long case against some wholesale grocers. So the person sitting in this chair in the last panel, his story was so familiar to me because independent grocers were increasingly having less choice, almost down to one. And what we alleged in that case was that there were two wholesale grocers, who are the ones who drive the trucks, into those grocery stores, conspiring to allocate customers in geographic territory. So in that case, what the grocers were seeing was less choice, but we were alleging that was deliberate and intentional. And so I think we look often at a macro level, but without the stories of the individuals here on this panel and previously, we can't do our job because we can't gather the facts to be able to understand that the intentional and deliberate actions are actually violations of antitrust law. And so I appreciate hearing about all the inputs, because that was another thing that I was thinking of in coming here today, was that, we look at seed, crops, cattle, poultry. So it is, like you said, what who you're trying to sell to, and then what you need in order to bring that to fruition. And the Attorney General's office has been looking at it from a variety of angles. Because the Attorney General was a former legislator, from day one when I joined the office, he said, okay, what laws are working for us, which aren't? If they aren't working for us, let's try to change them. And so we worked to support some laws in the Minnesota legislature. We're going to continue to look at places where we don't have the right tools, or we want the tools to be a little more clear about what we can and can't do when they aren't clear. And so that's been helpful, because it also is helping people recognize that maybe the existing tools need to be updated. Minnesota's antitrust law was written in the 1970s. A lot has changed since then, especially in our markets, especially in consolidation. And so that's one way. Another way is our federal enforcers sometimes are best positioned to be doing things. So the USDA is undergoing a process, because the current administration is looking at antitrust as a government of the whole. And so the Attorney General, under his leadership back in December, formed a coalition, a bipartisan coalition, to send the USDA a letter saying, here are some things that you should be doing under the Packers and Stockyards Act, being very specific about what us as states who have more connection to the people on the ground should be doing. And they are starting to take some of those steps. And now, recently, they have been making proposed rules to the Packers and Stockyards Act. So once again, under the Attorney General's leadership, a group of 10 states issued a comment, or submitted a comment to some of those proposed rules related to the poultry contract grower tournament system. And so hopefully we'll continue to be a leader under those where we want to kind of nudge the federal government when we can't directly partner with them on things that are important. I think the Attorney General is going to speak later today, and I anticipate that one of his themes will be that, the public is our partner here, and the more we can hear about what people are experiencing on the ground, the better we can do our jobs, because we need those facts to be able to establish whether or not and to what extent the antitrust laws are being violated.
Absolutely, thank you. And if I could ask you to build on that and kind of broadly, but I know that for the Attorney General, food and ag, and that space has been a focus. Why has that been a focus for the office, and what opportunities have you found to push antitrust action in Minnesota in the food and ag space?
Sure. So the Attorney General, his theme is affording your life, and he wants to make sure that every action he does within his office is aligned with that. And it's no greater than the food that, how you can put the food on the table, and that is so important. Minnesota is a huge agriculture state, and he recognizes that. And so our office, when he first took office, had 2 people plus a half a person doing antitrust law. He pushed the legislature to expand that to 4 people. So instead of kind of just managing what we had to manage from a national perspective, we can look more locally now and spend more resources there. We've partnered with the Minnesota Farmers Union to have a clerk who's here today doing agriculture antitrust research and being able to support our team on that. There are things that our office is investigating that I can't talk about because they're not public. So just know that we're working really hard. I think that's where it's nice, where we can issue comments and other things to kind of maybe preview what we may be doing behind the scenes. But I think that focusing really on from the beginning to the end of all of the agriculture systems, I think also there are a lot of mergers going on in this space as well. And so being able to put resources into looking at those mergers, one of the things that we've been seeing more recently is that vertical integration. So companies are acquiring other companies along the supply chain. And so taking a look and encouraging our federal enforcers to take a look at all the levels in which that particular merger may be impacting things. Everything from transportation, like the rail that is required to get, crops and other things to and from, being able to understand if a merger goes through, how will that impact each level of the market. So I think thankfully we have added resources. Hopefully someday we can add more. But I'm just continuing to try to lead on this from a Minnesota perspective.
Absolutely, thank you. And I love the Attorney General's tagline, which he's always sure to include, about affording your lives and living with dignity. And when he's spoken with us, he's connected really powerfully the idea that, if you're a dairy farmer and the company who buys your milk says they're not going to pick it up anymore, or they say they're going to pay you below the cost of production, that's taken away your dignity and taken away your opportunity to continue that operation to the next generation. And I was with Commissioner Peterson at the Department of Agriculture last night at a county convention after Hannah's, and he said, last month we lost 23 dairy farmers in Minnesota, and that was not an aberration, right? Those are folks who, if they're not raising cattle anymore at all, won't be hiring that local vet. They won't be hiring the HVAC installer. They won't be going to the local hardware store, making it tougher, in my mind, for young farmers to build a life in that community, the next generation, because all those support industries aren't there. And so I wonder if I could go back to Hannah, and if you could talk a little bit more about the challenges that beginning farmers face related to consolidation and the urgency in addressing market competition for the next generation of farmers.
Well, I have a similar story to the dairy story, in that another young farmer in my county who grew up on a dairy farm and wanted to continue to stay in agriculture, but also growing up on a farm, he had some of the same experiences as me, so he wanted to do things a little bit differently. So he convinced his dad to transition to growing organic grains. But when they looked at transitioning the dairy herd to being organic, they couldn't get an organic milk truck to drive and pick up milk from them. So now they have to buy in conventional feed to feed their dairy while they're growing their own organic grains. Thankfully, I get to buy those grains to feed my pigs. But, so as a beginner, where you are matters a lot in terms of what you have access to. And generally, when you're a beginner, you only have access to land that is not near those facilities you need because of the land prices. And so access to land is huge for beginners, and where land is affordable is often out of range of the services you need. I can say the same thing for rendering services. So I can't get access to rendering services for any dead stock. I have to use a wildcat sanctuary that happens to be in my county. So there's lots of, from both sides, there's things that are hard to access. And then, of course, there's the issue of access to capital too for beginners. Convincing a bank to lend to you when you don't have access to the tools you need to run your business is really difficult. Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. And thinking about access to capital, small businesses, Diana, we talked about workers that you represent as consumers, and building on what Justin asked the last panel, but what about potential business owners, in rural Minnesota? I think that's a really powerful idea that's harder to realize. And wondering if you could talk a little bit about the potential there, what would be needed to create that reality that folks could move into owning businesses independently.
Yeah, so there's a lot of meat packing places in rural Minnesota are, aging out and they would like to retire, but then there is no one to buy their business. And the workforce and the skill is just not there. People don't have, one, they don't have the capital, and then second, they don't have the skill to work in the industry. So we were talking, and Stu and I were talking, and I know in Ohio, UFCW has a worker owned cooperative for wholesaler. So they sell produce in the Cincinnati area. And I think it started about 10 years ago. And they've grown, but they've kind of stalled out. They haven't grown past, I think, like 15 worker owners. And the one reason they haven't grown is because they can't compete against the Walmart and the Krogers, right, of the area that can buy produce at a cheaper rate. So they've started this worker cooperative, but yet they can't grow because they can't compete with the other wholesalers in the region. So that's a problem. So I think, worker cooperatives are really interesting because, who has $10,000 to start a business, right? Or, and then pooling resources, and what does that look like? And I would just like to acknowledge that I know sometimes people say like, labor and farmers working together, like, whoa, that's, it's crazy. And I just think at the previous session, what the Amazon worker was talking about how, the boss is saying, oh, unions are bad, organizing is bad. They pit workers against each other, right? And they're fighting internally instead of the company, right? And I feel like that's the same thing what happens in R, right? Like they tell the farmers, oh, labor is the reason why you can't get a fair price. And they tell the worker who may be undocumented or who are just trying to survive, saying like, oh, well, it's the farmers who are, like we can't give you more because of the farmers, right? Like they're pitting us against each other, and we shouldn't be fighting against each other. We should be unified and say, no, the problem isn't the farmer asking for a fair price, and it's not the worker asking for a safe and dignified workplace. It's the company trying to impose these lesser standards on both the farmer and the worker. And so that's why, like, Stu and I have been trying to be very collaborative and saying, what can we do? How can we change this industry to support rural Minnesota, but also both farmers and workers?
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right that, workers are told to blame farmers and vice versa. And I think part of the challenge is the lack of transparency in the industry. It's really hard to tell who's making the gains. We have a clear idea as Farmers Union, but I wonder, Elizabeth, if you could talk a little bit more about what it takes for the state to build an antitrust claim, or a private firm like you did previously, the research it takes, where that exists, and where gaps are in getting the information that you need to build a case against these companies.
Sure, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think, one of the things I didn't previously mention is that often, the public, as I mentioned, can help because usually where the antitrust violations are occurring is where something's happening that doesn't make economic sense. There's a company acting against their own self-economic interest, previously, maybe they're selling something below cost. Why would they do that unless they were trying to deliberately harm a competitor? And so that's where I think if everyone out there is just making their own observations in their own communities, they can help us. One of the challenges in antitrust is that under current law, there's expert analyses that need to be done in order to assess whether there was harm and then how much that harm was. And so that can get expensive. We're trying to, as I mentioned, explore ways in which maybe the law should be different on that, especially for a public enforcer, because there might be, an abusive dominance standard, like the New York law was proposed, and in Minnesota there was a similar bill proposed as well. And so maybe shifting some of those burdens off of the state or the other federal enforcers and onto the companies that clearly have all of the bargaining power. That is something that, I think I heard so many stories of where the bargaining power is just gone, and they don't have the ability to bargain anymore because they have one sole supplier, or they have one sole company that they can sell their product or their labor to. And so there seems to be at least a better recognition that some things need to change. But right now, I think we can at least do our best under the existing laws and try to gather evidence, use the economic and expert resources we do have to bring cases. But the more information we can gather, the better.
Thank you. Yeah, and to build on that with your own idea, but I've also, this is something I'm passionate about as the kid of a mom who ran a small town newspaper, but the erosion of local news and the lack of actual reporting happening in these communities is a challenge for creating that public record too, and I've heard you talk about that.
Yeah, I was just
very
going to
passionate
say,
about
yeah,
it.
no, in the old grocers case that I was on in private litigation and in previous cases in private practice, we would look up old news stories on when plants would close, because often local newspapers would report on when plants would close down, and then we would have a record of when they closed. And now we don't necessarily have that local news reporting, and then it's up to the plant themselves to self-report when they're closing and what that's reasoning is. So yes, local news is a very good resource when they're there.
Powerful connection. Well, thank you for expanding on that. And I wonder if we can go to a couple questions. Does someone have a mic again, or we can? Fantastic.
So this question is for Hannah. I'm sorry if maybe you explained this before. You mentioned about that there are suppliers that is it that because of where your farm is located? Could you just explain a little bit more about that, of like that not being able to get the inputs to your farm? Is that accurate?
Well, for me, it's more about how far away the butcher is and what services they offer, and also because there's just so few, you kind of have to develop a relationship where they'll continue to work with you, so you can plan ahead, because you only get so many butcher dates, and you have to plan them a year in advance. I guess it's not so much the inputs, but the same thing as for like the dairy. So you have to be a certain size in order for them to even consider coming up to pick up from you. So oftentimes, in terms of inputs now, I guess this is coming into direct marketing too. So a lot of people are getting into shipping meat, direct marketing their meat that way. And it's getting really, really difficult for anyone of my size to buy like the shipping materials you need to do that. You have to order a whole pallet. And so that's where cooperatives come in. Now direct marketing farmers are trying to cooperate and buy these things together, share like warehouse space to store this stuff, and have the truck just deliver one place. So oftentimes it's about scale. Sometimes it's just distance, if it's like a physical location.
If I could add to that, while people are thinking, raise your hand if you have a question. But I think one thing we talk about, 4 packers in beef packing, and we think, oh, folks have 4 folks to sell cattle to. That's not true, right? It's 1 or 2, and if you have 2, God forbid, someone at the sale barn uses the bathroom, and then you only have 1. And those are the real stories we hear from farmers. Well, if there's no questions, I wonder if, and maybe we could start with Hannah, but if you could talk about something that makes you hopeful in this space. That can be a story or an idea, something you're excited to make true, but I think that's really important as well.
Yeah. Well, I think the wins Minnesota Farmers Union has had in the meat cutting programs at the Central Lakes College and the community colleges, and also the mobile meat processing unit, obviously. Like, it would be awesome if we could have more of those in our state, servicing more small farms. And I guess what makes me really hopeful is that that's what consumers want too. I don't have any shortage of customers, and what customers care about is not efficiency. They actually care about the opposite. They care about animal welfare, and they care about my care of the environment. And they also want the transparency to be able to come to my farm party once a year and actually see those animals in person. And so I'm really hopeful about kind of harnessing what the consumer wants to change some of these laws for farmers.
Thank you. Diana?
Yeah, I think what makes me hopeful is just being in this space, and I know working with Stu for the past couple of years, labor and farmers, I think back in the 80s and the 90s probably didn't make any sense, right? Or like people would laugh at it, and sometimes certain people still have that thought. But we're kind of challenging that thought and saying like, no, we can be partners and we can work together, because we should not be fighting ourselves. We should be fighting against really what's keeping both of us down, right? What's harming farmers and harming workers. And just being able to be in this space where we can work together, right? Because I want the animals to, I grew up in rural Minnesota too, right? Like I want the animals and the farmers to be treated well, because I know workers can't have a job and they can't buy the farmer's product unless they're being paid fairly, right? Like we are connected, and just supporting each other is just exciting.
Absolutely. Agreed on that. And speaking for the farmers, maybe not the union members, and hopefully even more soon, but there's not enough of us to stand without you. So we're proud to link arms. And Elizabeth.
I would say seeing antitrust as part of the national and local discourse. You know, this forum is a very good example. I've practiced in antitrust for a really long time. I used to have to explain what I did, and people would get glassy-eyed and not understand, and I do not have to do that anymore, because everybody, for better or worse, antitrust is now a tool that we need to use to kind of reverse some of the things that have happened over the last several decades. But I think just people in general have a better understanding, and that gives me hope.
That's fantastic. And last call for questions. Does anyone have anything for any of the panelists? All right. Well, Elizabeth, we'll end with you. If there was one thing that the state legislature could do next session that would make all of Hannah and my and Diana's dreams come true for a fair and competitive market in food and ag, what should they get done?
The antitrust bills?
Yeah.
Actually, though, also there's a right to repair bill.
Yep.
That would probably help local farmers. I think there is a no poach and no solicitation bill. There's a number of bills that the Minnesota Attorney General's office is supporting, and I bet they'll be up on the Minnesota Farmers Union website at some point, but I think, take a look at those. They'll probably have committee hearings on those, so make your voice heard.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Round of applause.